Your trade deadline is probably coming up in fantasy, so now is the time to make a deal. And in this video, we're going to talk about the players that you want to trade for and trade away before that deadline. And we'll start with the Browns running back Jerome Ford, who is a buy candidate before week 11 begins. Now, Ford in this matchup, he had a great game. He goes over 100 yards, remained highly efficient, and this was a brutal spot. He was on the road against arguably the best defense in the Baltimore Ravens. Now, I'm not just using this production in this one game for the reason you want to buy him. It's what he's done recently in terms of his usage. Because check out his last two games according to Fantasy Life, our official data partner. This is all free data and information you can use. Over these last two games, and this is the key point, since he's been healthy, he's earned 65% of the snaps and 55% of the rush attempts. But if you take out quarterback runs, he's actually earned over 65% of the running back carries. In week 8, he was banged up, but he started to see all the usage in the second half as they were more confident in his health, and since then, this has been his backfield. It's the most usage he's seen in a 2-game stretch now with Kareem Hunt on this team and active. And look, Kareem Hunt still has a role. He found a touchdown in this game. He's now scored in like 4 straight games, but he hasn't been efficient, just 10 carries for 32 yards, and he's mostly seeing a short yardage role and some, not all, some red zone usage. So Brown is heating up at the perfect time, and he's still been efficient per touch this season. Now, he's not Nick Chubb in this offense. Nobody is Nick Chubb maybe in the entire NFL, but he has been good. He's been a top 20 running back in terms of yards created per touch. This is his efficiency. And it also helps that he's playing in the #1 rush offense in the league. They're running over 34 running plays per game. That is #1. Now, maybe this changes a little bit if Deshaun Watson can continue to find some success in the passing attack, but this team is built to run the ball. That's what they were to start the year with Nick Chubb. That's what they still are now with Jerome Ford and Kareem Hunt. And things should continue for Ford as his upcoming schedule is nice. A matchup against the Broncos in 2 weeks, that's fantastic. And in the fantasy playoffs, he'll get the Bears at home, not a great defense, and the Texans, who are the second worst run defense in the league through 10 weeks. So look to acquire Jerome Ford and this next RB. And that is the Patriots running back Ramondre Stevenson, who had a solid week in terms of points this past game, but even better usage. And now before we get into that usage, I know you might be thinking, oh, but Mac Jones has been bad. He's going to get benched and replaced, and this offense is atrocious. That's true. But we have seen plenty of running backs survive in bad offenses, especially when they have pass catching skills like Ramondre Stevenson. Now, in week 10 against the Colts, we continued to see in that awful Germany game where the Patriots offense was borderline unwatchable, we continued to see at least Ramondre C usage, 5 targets, passing game usage remained strong, but also a season high 23 touches and goes over 100 total yards in this game. Now, the coaches clearly don't trust Mac Jones, and I don't think they're going to give all of their trust to Bailey Zappi either, which means some more usage should continue for Stevenson. And his overall role in the offense has now increased for 3 straight weeks. After the first month and a half of the season, we were concerned it was becoming a split backfield with Zeke. That hasn't been the case, as he played 68% of the snaps and handled 59% of the rush attempts in this past game, and oh yeah, a season high 71% of the routes run. And that routes run and passing game usage is important because that's how he got there last year as basically a top 10 running back. Stevenson now has 5 or more targets in 4 of his last 5 games. And when he sees at least 5 targets this season, he averages 17 fantasy points. All of that totals to him ranking top 5 in overall running back targets this season, and maybe we can get a little bit more efficiency if a quarterback replacement comes in. I don't think that'll be the case, but if that's the case, you'll see more red zone drives, which means his red zone touches, only 18 so far, will increase as well. You have some favorable matchups upcoming for this overall offense and Ramondre on the ground, a matchup against the Giants and the Chargers, which are 2 of the bottom 5 run defenses in the league. And then when you scroll a little bit more for the fantasy playoffs, he opens up the fantasy playoffs against a Broncos, terrible run defense, and the Bills, who have been borderline one of the worst defenses in the league the last 5-6 weeks. We just saw the Broncos even have success against them. So consider Ramondre a nice buy low after having just a fine week, but not a big upside week because he didn't find the end zone. And similar can be said for this next rookie. And that's the Ravens rookie receiver Zay Flowers, who didn't find the end zone this past week, but something important happened. On the season, we've been seeing Zay Flowers just be targeted like on average 7 yards downfield. It doesn't lead to a lot of big plays, but that doubled in week 10. And that led to 73 yards on just 6 targets for Zay Flowers. But these 6 targets were still 30% of the Ravens targets that led the team, and it was a massive bounce back after he only had 1 catch last week. As he starts to see more targets downfield like this past week, if that stays steady, you're going to see a lot more explosive plays like you did in week 10. And in week 10, he operated as the clear #1 receiver as he has for most of the year. As you can see right here, he led the team in snaps, routes run, and targets. He had 2 more targets than any other receiver on this team. And now when you look at it on the entire season, according to Fantasy Life, as you can see right here, his season target share is 25%. That ranks top 12 amongst all receivers, not just rookies in the NFL, earning 25% of the targets. Would have finished top 15 last year. And then when you take out just his 3% target share week 9, that stinker from him and the offense, he's actually earning 20% or more of the targets in every other game. So Flowers is continuing to rise up the rankings just based on volume, and now he's seeing more downfield usage, which is where he showed, even though he's a smaller receiver, he could actually win on the outside and downfield in college. If your trade deadline isn't up yet, he's somebody you want to consider buying because look at these next 3 weeks. He faces arguably 3 of the bottom 5 secondaries in the league. The Bengals have been up and down. We saw last week the Texans take advantage of them. The Chargers are arguably the worst secondary in the NFL, and the Rams are right there with them with a lack of talent in their secondary unit. So look to acquire Zay Flowers. Now this next guy you want to trade away, but before we get there, 65% of people who watch aren't subscribed. It takes 2 seconds and we are very close to 100,000 subscribers. Now is the time to subscribe if you'd like to help me get there, and it makes it easier for you to see my future content. Now that player you want to trade away is Brian Robinson because he had a very weird day in week 10. Now it was weird in a good way because he was the highest scoring running back at the position, but he did it in an uncharacteristic way. As you can see right here, he goes off against the Seattle Seahawks on the road, and how does he do it? Well, look at this, 119 receiving yards on 6 targets. He entered this game with only like 130 yards through the air on the year, and then he basically matches it in one game, catches 100% of his targets, and finds the end zone through the air. Yeah, that's probably not sustainable, especially when you consider he still wasn't seeing like an increase in his passing game usage. He ran less routes once again than Antonio Gibson, and Gibson very quietly now has 3 straight games of 5 or more targets. This was just an outlier performance on a couple of big catches for Robinson. And it doesn't help that he continues to be not all that efficient on the ground. Under 40 rushing yards again last week, and now on the season, he ranks 37th out of every running back in the league, averaging just 3.8 yards per carry. So he's really inconsistent in the air for the most part, other than this past week not doing anything there, and he's been very inefficient on the ground. It also hurts him that according to Player Profiler, this right here, the team run plays per game, they rank dead last. They're only running 20 run plays per game because this offense is on pace to set the NFL record for pass attempts in the season. So yeah, the flip side of that is they're probably not running a lot, and if they're passing a lot, Gibson is seeing more targets like we just mentioned, not Robinson outside of this past game. So that's a bit of a concern because it's still a split backfield where he's not getting much on the ground, and when they're in the red zone, they're throwing even there at a top 3 rate in the league. So if you can still sell, if you're still in the window where it's not your trade deadline, look to sell him now. Or you can wait one more week, but then maybe your trade deadline is up because this week the Commanders are 10-point favorites against a really bad Giants defense. It sets up nicely for a game where you can see 16 to 18 to maybe even 20 plus touches for Brian Robinson in a touchdown or 2. So if you wanted to hold off for one more week, that's fine. I just don't know when your trade deadline is. That's up for you to decide. Now you could put Brian Robinson in a package deal for this next back, and that would be Breece Hall, who on Sunday Night Football kind of had a stinker, only 10 fantasy points. It was about time, right? Like he only averaged 2 yards per carry, 2.2 yards per carry, 13 carries, 28 yards. He was going off every week. This was bound to happen. And here is that poor performance from Breece Hall. Look, it's as simple as this. The Raiders aren't a great run defense, but when you can stack the box and dare Zach Wilson to beat you through the air and he can't, yeah, it makes it a lot easier to put 7 guys in there and just stop Breece Hall. But the interesting thing was, despite the poor game on the ground, Hall still got there, more on that in a second, but he actually saw season high usage. Because according to Fantasy Life, he played 71% of the snaps, his most on the season, and he saw 76% of the carries, which was his second most. He's actually seen now over his last 2 games, 80% of the carries in this backfield. That's his best stretch of his career, even dating back to last season. And because of his passing game usage, he was still able to put up a respectable week, even though it was a down week in week 10. Because as you can see right here, he caught all 3 of his targets for 47 yards. So in your PPR formats, he had nearly 8 points right there. So even when you're getting a stinker, no touchdowns and under 30 rushing yards in this game, you still get 10 fantasy points. You'll take that as his floor weeks because of how good he is as a receiver. And if you watch this game, you know that he also had a touchdown call back for kind of an iffy call on CJ Uzomah. So if he gets that touchdown, you're looking at another week of over 15 fantasy points, and nobody's even talking about it because his usage remains so strong. Hall still ranks top 5 this season in yards per touch. He led the NFL last year in yards per touch before getting injured. This year, he's averaging 5.9 yards per touch. So, I mean, as long as he continues to see these 15, 16 plus touch weeks, which basically should happen every single week the way this offense is designed, he'll continue to be a top RB. And what do you know? His next matchup is going to be against the Buffalo Bills defense that we said has been struggling. And oh yeah, Breece Hall should be able to take advantage of them. And then when he enters the fantasy playoffs, he gets great matchups at home against the Texans and nice matchups where there should be a lot of points against teams like the Dolphins and the Commanders' shaky defense. So look to acquire Breece Hall off of his down week, and then check out this next player. And that next player is James Conner, who actually returned from injury after being on IR and missing 4 games. He returned in week 10. Now, Conner's performance leaves a lot to be desired, but we have to look underneath the table at his underlying usage to see if it was still strong like it was earlier this year. Because to start the season off, and the reason why Conner was a buy low in previous videos was because of this right here. In his 4 games to start the season when healthy, according to Fantasy Life, he was seeing 70% of the snaps and 62% of the rush attempts. But when you take away Joshua Dobbs' quarterback runs in those first 4 weeks, he was seeing over 75% of the the backfield touches, a top 5 role during that time out of running backs. Now, unfortunately, in his return, he did not go off. Connor returned in the same game where Kyler Murray was out there, and he did have 16 carries for 73 yards, which is a fine day on the ground, but no touchdowns. So, you get under 10 fantasy points, under 8 fantasy points here, and nothing in the receiving department, which is a little bit of a concern. A more mobile quarterback in Kyler Murray. He looked healthy last week. He wasn't looking to check down as opposed to take off and run. So that performance wasn't great, but here is the good news. It's going to lead to maybe people being like, I waited this long and this guy did nothing. I will trade him before the deadline. But look at this. 63% of the snaps and 67% of the rush attempts commanded the backfield. And when you take away Kyler's carries, this was over 85% of the rush attempts for James Conner. So yes, we want more than 7 fantasy points, but if Kyler looks as good as he did, they're going to start scoring more touchdowns. Connor will see some of those, and he's going to get checkdowns just like he did last year with Kyler Murray. This is just a 1-game sample where he didn't. And this is a guy that you want to target because next week he's going up against the Texans run defense. That the only run defense worse than them in the league is probably his own team in the Arizona Cardinals. Nice matchup against the Rams. That's a beatable matchup. And then when you enter the fantasy playoffs, you're going to have spots where probably they're going to be trailing in games. So that's where you'll see some checkdowns for Connor. So the veteran is still a buy low option, and so is this next RB coming out of the bye. This is a guy we talked about in previous weeks. It's DeAndre Swift, who hasn't had a top 10 week now in over a month because he's coming off of the bye week. So he's kind of been useless, or at least hasn't had a massive week for the guy who has him in your league in like 4 to 5 weeks. So they might not be thinking, oh, I have to hold on to this player. Last time we saw Swift before the bye week, he only posted 9.4 points in that really good game against Dallas, but kind of like situationally, he was really good. He had a couple of big plays. You could see the strong usage here, 20 total touches, 74 yards. You would like for him to be a little bit more efficient in this contest, but overall, he looked solid if you actually watched the game. And those 20 touches are great usage, and the underlying metrics now, his last 2 starts are strong. 67% of the snaps, 71% of the rush attempts, and when you take away his quarterback's rushes, Jalen Hurts, DeAndre Swift has handled 90% of the rush attempts the last 2 games out of the running backs. So this is great, and maybe we give him a little bit of a pass in week 9 against the Cowboys because they do have a good defense. It's hard to be efficient against them. It's also worth noting that Jalen Hurts, who already seems banged up this year, hurt his MCL in his knee in that last game against Dallas. Maybe he'll be a little bit less mobile. That helps Swift maybe earn some more check down targets. Now, Swift has some nice matchups coming up against the Chiefs and Bills, but if you look at this right here, his fantasy playoff schedule, the Giants, that is fantastic. They might be up 2 scores and just hand the ball off 20 times to him. And then the Cardinals at home, that's also fantastic in a week where they're probably trying to play for the #1 overall seed. You can see them against the Cardinals' last ranked run defense, maybe giving Swift 20 plus touches as well. And if your team was to play through week 18 of the fantasy playoffs, Swift gets the Giants run defense again. So I'm looking to acquire Swift, and maybe you can do it in some sort of deal for this next guy. And that would be the Lions running back David Montgomery, who returned in week 10, but we did not see the strong usage that we got earlier this season from him. Now, if you're just looking at the finishing touches here in the overall game log, it was a nice return for him. Over 20 fantasy points, cracks 100 yards on just 12 carries, and finds the end zone. But if you watch this game or you tracked it on your phone or just some tweet updates, you know that he had a 75-yard rushing touchdown, which without that, he would have only had in this game like 4 or 5 fantasy points. So that's just one part of the story. The other part is the underlying usage. It was a big concern because this is a tweet from Dwayne McFarland on Twitter. You can follow him over there. He posts a lot of good content. You can see Gibbs versus Montgomery. The rookie played 58% of the snaps compared to just 38% for David Montgomery. And look at this right here. Inside the 5-yard line, they both saw the same amount of usage inside the 5. Gibbs had multiple goal line touchdowns in this game. He was much more involved as a receiver, 64% of the snaps versus 33%. Had actually a decent target share, 16%. No targets for David Montgomery. That's a little bit of a concern here because Gibbs has been great now for the past month. The rookie's averaging nearly 7 yards per touch. It's top 5 amongst running backs over this past month of the season, and they kept giving him the ball. Now, maybe Montgomery just isn't fully healthy, and if you have him, fingers crossed, that's what you're hoping for. He sees a bigger role in future weeks. But if you can get something better for him, or maybe more sustainable with less competition, I would do that. Now, you're not trying to sell him low. He just scored 20 points. You're hoping that your league mate doesn't notice that he only played 38% of the snaps, and maybe you can trade him for somebody like Swift we talked about earlier in this video. Now, again, I want to emphasize that you're not selling him low. He should still see a lot of work this season, and in most weeks, he'll be seeing 14 or 15 plus touches and getting some goal line and red zone usage in a top 5 offense behind a top 5 offensive line. He also will benefit from a nice fantasy playoff schedule that opens up against the Denver Broncos at home, and then a divisional matchup against the Lions, which should be a very close game. Maybe they trust a veteran in Montgomery in key situations more than the rookie Gibbs. So only look to trade away David Montgomery if you can get something nice in return like DeAndre Swift, and then look to acquire this next asset. And that would be the fantasy blueprint that 4,000 plus people are already using to help them win their matchup this week, get to the fantasy playoffs, and take home a championship. Every day of the week, I send you a different type of tool, whether it's for the waiver wire, projections and rankings, rest of season rankings, or the game-by-game matchup notes. Here's one snippet of the game-by-game notes from a previous week. We were filtering this by wide receiver, and it basically just lets you know what the wide receiver has done that year, what the advantage is in terms of size and speed against the cornerback they're facing, and how that cornerback has been on that season. Is it a good matchup? Is it a bad matchup? What they're giving up per route run, what they're giving up fantasy points wise. This is all very key information, just a small snippet of what you get in the blueprint. And it's extremely simple to acquire. You just scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in the description below and follow the 2 simple steps. And here are those 2 simple steps, but I want to point this out right here. It's just $5 for the rest of the year. So you might be saying, oh, but my fantasy playoffs are in like 4 or 5 weeks. This isn't worth my time. No, it's just $5. And if you don't make your fantasy playoffs, I'll refund that $5, making this completely risk-free. So to get access to your fantasy blueprint today and push towards the fantasy playoffs, be sure to scan the QR code on the screen or click that link in the description below. Follow the 2 simple steps. All right, now back to some players I want to try and acquire, and it's the Pittsburgh Steelers wide receivers after a down week, and more specifically Deontay Johnson. Because Deontay Johnson had a very uncharacteristic week. Normally he's getting high volume, had just 1 catch on 4 targets in week 10 against the Packers. And this led to him scoring just 2.7 fantasy points. If you're in a half PPR, it was even less fantasy points. It's not the week you were trying to see in a matchup against the Packers, where the Packers just traded away Rasul Douglas as starting cornerback. Jair Alexander missed this game, and then they put 2 other defensive backs on IR. They were down 4 of their starting defensive backs, and this is the outcome you get. Not great. And obviously George Pickens also struggled because of this, but there was a clear reason why. It really didn't have a lot to do with these wide receivers as opposed to the game plan for the Steelers. Because Kenny Pickett in this game only threw 22 times because they leaned on the run. The Packers don't have a great run defense, and because of that, the starting running backs, the 2 top guys for the Steelers, ran the ball 15 times for Warren, 16 times for Harris, 31 total times compared to just 22 passes. And out of those 22 passes, 60% of them went to these running backs or the tight ends. They just weren't throwing the ball downfield because they just didn't have to. Now, it made for an ugly game for the passing attack and Kenny Pickett, and it was honestly ugly to watch as well. It was like an old school football game, just a bunch of carries, but that's not going to happen in most weeks. This was an outlier week because we've seen Deontay Johnson in his previous games before this one see over 30% of the targets for this team, and he actually got in the end zone last week. Everything is trending up for this guy. 1 off week. And he's somebody you want to acquire because 5 out of his next 6 games, I mean, look how good this schedule is. He'll be facing bottom 10 secondaries. He gets this week against the Cardinals, then the Patriots, then the Colts. Those are all bottom 10 secondaries. A matchup against the Bengals, who have been up and down this season, but against quality receivers have struggled. And then in the fantasy playoffs, he'll finish it off with a matchup against the Seahawks, which is about probably the best secondary that he'll face during the stretch. And even there, an average secondary. I mean, Seattle just allowed over 300 passing yards and 3 touchdowns to the Commanders, and mostly like their running backs. So don't be afraid to buy low on Deontay Johnson and Pickens. I would much prefer Deontay there. And then the number 1 trade target we have to talk about is Cooper Kupp, who has not scored over 7 fantasy points in the past month, but we have to break this down a little bit more. Because last week he was on the bye, so of course he's going to score 0 points. And the week before that, he had to play with Brett Rypien, who struggled immensely with accuracy, barely completing 40% of his passes. And then if you go back even more, the week before that, Matthew Stafford was injured in the game. Brett Rypien had to come in on short notice. So it's been like 3 weeks, the last 3 weeks he hasn't been usable because of a bye and his injured quarterback. But let's not forget what this guy has done on the season in just a short amount of time. He's still averaging 9 targets per game, and in 3 healthy games with Matt Stafford, he's averaging over 18 fantasy points and 9.5 targets per contest. And it's even likely that as soon as this week, Matt Stafford should return to this offense, which means you should get Cooper Kupp right back after the bye week, another week for Sean McVay to game plan for this specific matchup this week. All of that is really good news for Cooper Kupp, and so is his playoff schedule. Because to close out the season and in the fantasy playoffs, he gets the Washington Commanders, who have allowed the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, then a more tough matchup against the Saints, but it's not brutal. They've been having injuries in their secondary and overall defense. Marshawn Lattimore now injured, so that could actually be a favorable matchup by the time this comes. And then the Giants, who we just saw Dak Prescott go for 450 total yards and 5 touchdowns against. This is arguably the best playoff schedule you can get for maybe the best receiver in the league still. Yes, somebody you should buy low, the number 1 trade target. Now, one of the better running back targets in trades is going to be coming off of his bye week as well. And that's the Chiefs running back Isaiah Pacheco, who the last time we saw him in week 9, it wasn't great, just 6.6 fantasy points, but it kind of hid that he saw career high usage. Because according to Fantasy Life, again, our official data partner, in week 9, he played 70% of the snaps. That was a season high and career high, and saw 76% of the rush attempts, again, season high and career high. Now, over his last 3 games, as you can see right here, he's handling 70% of the backfield carries. And not only that, but he also saw before the bye week 54% of the routes run, which was a season high. He's now played in back-to-back games more passing down snaps than Jerick McKinnon. He's becoming very quietly a 3-down workhorse. And now here's what he's done over the past 6 games. He's played 60% of the snaps, seen 70% of the rush attempts, and is averaging 20 opportunities per game. So all of that is great, but it's not just the usage. He's also been efficient because he's created the 4th most yards this year. Okay, well, you could say he's had a lot of touches and a good offense. He really hasn't, but if you look at his yards created per touch, still top 15 in yards created per touch, much better than he was last season. And let me remind you, this is the Chiefs offense that outside of Patrick Mahomes Mahomes and Travis Kelce's connection could use some pass catchers, especially in the receiving department. We might see that move up a little bit. Even better news for Pacheco. Now, his upcoming schedule this week on Monday night is really tough, but he is at home, at least coming off of the bye week. He'll be facing the Eagles. That's a brutal matchup. But after that, nice matchups against the Raiders, maybe the best matchup you can find right now against the Packers. And if not the Packers, then the second best matchup you could find right now might be the Bills at home a week after that. So look to buy low on Pacheco. A guy we talked about earlier, David Montgomery. I would actually try and deal Montgomery for Pacheco if you can. I think that's a deal you could get done. Or heck, maybe you could even just trade Noah Brown straight up. Noah Brown right now has been fantastic. He never had a 100-yard game in his first 69 career games until 2 weeks ago, where in now back-to-back weeks, he has 150 yards in each contest. And that improved last week when there was no Nico Collins against the Bengals shaky secondary, where he catches 7 of 8 targets for 172 yards. He's being targeted downfield by CJ Stroud, accurate targets, but also being schemed basically wide open. All of this is great news. It's why you should add him off of your waiver wire, but let's be honest, he's not going to be the number 2 fantasy receiver like he has the past 2 weeks the rest of the season, especially once Nico Collins comes back. Don't get me wrong, Noah Brown in this offense is still a solid flex option, maybe even wide receiver 2 or 3 for you, just not the stud that he has been, so you might as well try and sell high if you can. Because there's a lot of options in this passing attack. 4 weeks where they actually have good weeks, because there will still be some down weeks with a rookie quarterback, although Stroud has been great. You still have Nico Collins once he comes back and gets healthy. Nathaniel Dell, Tank Dell that is. John Mechie's running routes. Robert Woods is now healthy, and then you have Dalton Schultz who's coming off of a 10+ target week. I mean, you have like 4 or 5 guys who are going to rotate into this offense. I do think Noah Brown will continue to see nice usage, just not this elite like wide receiver 1 AJ Brown usage. So just expect more 8 to 12 point days and not 20+ point days for Noah Brown. Whoever you could trade him for, maybe one of the guys we talked about in this video, put him in a package deal, I would look to do that. So now these are the players who can improve your team before the trade deadline, but also the waiver wire is a way to improve your team. And there's some guys out there who are available in over 90% of leagues. This video right here will help you see who the best options are for this week. Now, if you made it to the end, you had to get some sort of help out of this video. 65% of people aren't subscribed. Just make sure that you're not one of them. It takes really 2 seconds no matter which device you're watching on, and it does help me as we push towards 100,000 subscribers.